We're experimenting with this video format. We've just been doing audio, prior to this, so it's kind of fun to try the video format. We're going to try recording these for, especially we interestingly have a lot of international folks who have requested to join us, but it's literally 2-3 in the morning in their neck of the woods, and so they're like, "Can you please record these for us?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." So we'll try to do it with the video. So we got it on Discord, we got it on Instagram Live, and we have it on Clubhouse. So we're gonna see if simulcasting all three of these is gonna be helpful. All right, let me see if I can actually, if I click into the radio show, can you still see me and hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
In Discord at least.
Yeah. Do you want to kick things off, and do you have any questions? Or I know you've been chatting a little bit on the DMs, but it might be fun to have you kick us off with any particular questions or thoughts you have on your mind.
Yeah, you talked about, and maybe this isn't the right question, but something that is top of mind is I'm like trying to kind of design a workout plan and setup at home.
Mm-hmm.
Now that COVID is pretty hot around here and going to the gym doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Sure.
Just got a couple kettlebells literally today that arrived in the mail, a 35 pound and a 52 pound, but I'm super new to it.
Excellent.
I've got a really shitty pull-up bar, and I'm all limbs, so I can I can't actually do a dead hang without my knees touching the ground.
Oh, no.
We can make it work. But yeah, I don't know. That is definitely new to me to be working out without a barbell. And so thoughts on home gym stuff and hacks with that are helpful.
For sure. No, it's a great question. Obviously a very timely one given the whole workout from home situation. By the way, I think it's such an interesting time. I was working in venture capital before I started this new company, and there was a lot of interest in the home workout space, obviously with not only Peloton, but there's a bunch of other companies out there in the space like Tonal, which is like a Peloton for strength training. There's Form Life as well that is producing that. There's Mirror that has like a yoga version of that. And it's kind of interesting because some of the criticism around the companies was, who's going to pay a few $1,000 for a machine that they can work out at home? It's a very like elitist thing. But obviously with COVID, I think it's probably a trend I don't think will go away entirely. In terms of, there's going to be a ton of people who go back to gyms, including myself, but I think there's going to be a ton of people that are going to invest in home gyms and home equipment, just because they like the comfort and the convenience, and obviously the safety is a plus. So I think that's huge. I'm kind of curious, what was your workout routine pre-COVID, and what are you doing? What have you been doing lately?
Well, I'm a weird example. You can see this elk and this bow hunter on my hoodie.
Yeah.
So the last 3 months, I've been essentially doing huge miles in the woods with a weighted pack and a heavy rifle, and I've just been doing big miles with a lot of weight in the woods.
Yeah.
So hunting season, it's a little bit more of like an athletic training season for me, in the
Totally.
sense that I've got this 3-month chunk in Montana every year that I'm focused on that. So I'm moving into what I hope will be kind of like a winter bulking and just not even bulking, but getting stronger phase. Mm-hmm. But I've never done that without a barbell. So my plan is to kind of spend the winter getting as strong as I can and putting on. I saw your post about if you're not in the overweight BMI with a physical 6-pack, right? You need to like that. And I was like, okay, that's a good goal. I'd like to be getting there towards the spring. And then in the spring, I switched to mountain biking and climbing mountains, essentially, not like rock climbing, but hiking up mountains with a loaded pack to train for hunting season. But in the winter, that's kind of where my focus is getting some more muscle mass.
That's awesome. That's amazing. That's like the best example I think of functional training there is. It's just going and hunting a giant animal that you can eat. I wish I was in more hunting territory, but LA, you're probably hunting for more cougars than elk out here, I would say, unfortunately. But no, I think it's amazing. You should keep on doing that. The funny thing is, I'm a behavioral psychologist, right, or a behavioral health psychologist, and there's so much debate in the world about what is the optimal workout plan and also what is the optimal diet. And I actually do have, strong points of view about both of those things. But when we're talking about that, we're talking about a matter of optimization. I think from a behavioral standpoint, for instance, in the nutrition side of things, there are differences between diets in terms of outcomes. So for instance, like there's a bunch of low carb versus low fat studies, and they do produce differential outcomes. I would argue if you're particularly on the diabetes spectrum and you need to control your blood sugar levels, low carb is probably superior to low fat diets. Now, net though, if you're talking about just like general weight loss and body recomposition, the differences are relatively small compared to compliance. I always say compliance is king, and I think it's the best motto that anyone can have, whether you're talking about diet or exercise, because the best workout plan and the best diet is basically the one that you're willing to do and stick with forever, right? So if you get joy out of, hunting, hiking, climbing, because it has a secondary benefit of obviously being out in nature, feeding yourself or your family, enjoying the great outdoors, etc. Is it maybe like the most optimal type of workout, relatively compared to, I don't know what, cross country skiing in terms of producing VO2 max? Maybe not. But if it gets you to get out there every single day for even if it's 3 months during hunting season, I would say that is the optimal workout, because it's the one that you're actually going to do, right? So there's no point of designing an optimal workout that someone's not realistically going to do. Like if I go tell a guy to go do Pilates and he hates it and he doesn't show up to class, it doesn't matter what the research literature says. It's all about what you're willing to do. So I always say that's the first and foremost rule of any workout plan, is just be super realistic about what are you willing to do and able to sustain long term, because that matters. And it's the same thing with women too, right? Like if you talk about, like, there's a lot of folks who don't like traditional gym going weightlifting. And so for them, maybe Pilates is good because you're just doing body weight stuff, or doing a Zumba class, or dancing, or it could be even like a non-traditional workout. My parents actually, they're older now, they're retired. They did do strength training. Obviously they go to the gym, and good for them for doing so, especially in their age. But they also, they do stuff like gardening, which a lot of people wouldn't consider to be a workout per se. But certainly, I think for older folks, it is exercise, gets them vitamin D, and most importantly, they enjoy it. So definitely find something that I would say.
I do some gardening too. You got to hold a deep squat sometimes.
Yeah, that's true.
For a long time.
Absolutely. So I think that's the first principle, and everyone skips over that in terms of just making a generic recommendation. But obviously, given what you shared, you're probably a fitter kind of person. You're obviously more motivated, and you obviously are inclined to do strength training or weightlifting. So I think given those things, those unique elements that I can give a little bit more personalization. So there's 3 sort of general rules of thumb that I think are really, really helpful in designing an overall kind of fitness and workout program. And I think it's actually underappreciated because people don't sort of think about physical activity holistically. What I mean by that is I'll actually just share a personal example from my life. So I was always a competitive athlete. I ran competitively from 800 meters to 5K. And so for me, doing high intensity, structured exercise was pretty much something you always did for basically an hour a day, right? Whether it's going to the gym, going for a run, etc. And there was always this notion that as long as you do that, you're basically good for the day, right? Plus, especially you got work, you got school, you got other things going on. You want to be working out all day. So I think the research literature, though, has shown that that's actually not enough. Meaning, if you're sitting for 15 hours a day, and then you're doing your 1 hour of workout, even if it's a really intense run or a lifting session, it probably does not completely counteract being sedentary for all the rest of the time. And I think this is almost becoming especially true during COVID, because we're way more sedentary than ever. I still actually maintain a private practice doing executive coaching with CEOs and VCs, and I literally monitor their step counts. And a lot of these guys, especially if you're coming from the Bay Area or a very walkable city where you're walking to meetings, you're walking to and from work, you're walking to get a cup of coffee even, you can almost accidentally get 5,000 steps a day. That's plummeted to, I would say, 2,000 to 3,000 steps on average. So the first principle I would say is you have to do what's called LISS, low intensity steady state exercise, LISS. And so very much when I work with folks, I always say, make sure you are tracking your steps. Some people, they don't need to think about it because of where they live or the type of lifestyle that they have, they're hitting their step counts without even thinking about it. I would say based on the research literature, for most people, the goal is about 7,500 steps a day, or the equivalent of about 30 minutes of walking, even if you're not tracking your steps. I would say as a guy, it's a little bit easier. All you have to do is keep your iPhone in your pocket. It'll track your steps for you passively. You don't even need any sort of fitness tracker device. If you don't want to carry your phone with you all the time, just use a timer or use common sense. 30 minutes is about the amount of walking that you should be doing every single day. The Japanese came up with the whole 10,000 steps a day rule. There's no research behind it. I think it's just a nice round number. That's why they picked it. But yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. If you want to do the extra 2,500 to get that 10,000, great. But 7,500 is kind of the peak at which you're getting kind of optimal benefit. Everything after that is kind of diminishing marginal utility, I would say. So I would say that's principle number one is no matter what, make sure you're getting enough just kind of walking or low intensity activity, anything that's other than sitting, I would say. Like gardening would actually be an example of a low intensity, steady state activity. You're going out, watering your plants for 30 minutes a day, walking around, that totally counts. So that's...
Put a standing desk in like a balance board count? I mean, I'm still sitting still in a sense, but I have a standing desk and one of those little, swivel like balance boards. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it does count. I wouldn't say it's as great as walking. I think human beings are very much designed to walk. In fact, we're, the type of hunting that we do is like persistence hunting, where we literally tire the animal out, right? And you'd appreciate that as a hunter. So I would say it does count, but I would say it's probably not a full substitute. For instance, if you're just standing at your desk all day and you're doing almost no walking, I wouldn't say that's as good as doing your 7,500 steps. But let's say you did 5,000 steps and you're standing at your standing desk. That's probably, the combination thereof is probably sufficient and probably equivalent or greater than 7,500 steps. So as long as you're still doing some walking, I would say it's still pretty good in terms of avoiding sedentariness. I actually tweeted about this, by the way. There's a really, really interesting study they did with hunter-gatherers because they were interested in like how sedentary are folks who do not literally have chairs, right? And it was very, very interesting in that they're not doing actually way more physical activity than we are in terms of like, let's say walking. That was actually one of the surprising findings, but they're definitely not sitting as much. They're squatting, right? They kind of do like, as some people like to call it, like an Asian squat. They sit down and kind of just like sit there and do their cooking or whittling or whatever it is that they're doing. But what we consider sitting, meaning sitting in a chair, it's pretty low amount of their daily time or hours that they're doing. So I think we just, have to be kind of cognizant of that. My personal view, by the way, on standing desks is if you like it, it's great. You probably shouldn't be standing all day. There's a lot of research literature from barbers, pharmacists, folks who have like jobs where they have to stand all day. In terms of like the effect on the vasculature of your lower body, varicose veins, it can promote that. And it almost makes common sense too. If you're used to standing all day, your legs get tired, it's uncomfortable, your feet hurt, you develop problems. Listen to your body, I would say. Never force it to a point where you're actually like your knees, your joints, your feet are hurting. That's your body giving you feedback that maybe you're standing too much, right? I would say it's much more common that we're essentially squatting, lying, walking, or sprinting, right? We're doing some combination thereof, at least in terms of traditional hunter-gatherer society, but not a lot of like either sitting in your butt in a chair sitting, or conversely standing for long periods of time, like in one place, I would say. So that's the way that I would think about it. I actually tell people you don't have to even use a standing desk at all. The main rule of thumb is, you should be getting up, at least within every 20 to 50 minutes and just going for a walk. Even if it's in an office setting, get up, go to the bathroom, go get a drink of water, just go walk around. And Cornell actually, they have an ergonomics department. They did a bunch of the research analysis, and that was their conclusion too. They're like, you don't have to use a standing desk. It's great if you want to use it occasionally. If you're going to use it, obviously interchange between sitting and standing. Don't stand all day. But for most folks, just taking a break and going on regular periodic walks is sufficient. The way that I like to do it and getting my steps is not actually going for long walks. It's taking 5-minute breaks after 25-minute meetings, 10-minute breaks after 50-minute meetings. And just through the natural course of taking breaks between meetings, because obviously all of us are tired from being on Zoom all day, it allows us to get our walks in. So highly, highly recommend that. And I actually believe it's more optimal to take small mini walks, kind of these more frequent walks, rather than a 30-minute walk. I'll give you an example of that. There's a paper that actually a colleague of mine published where they got the subjects to take 3 10-minute walks after every single meal, right? And it's kind of a Lindy thing if you think about it. It didn't require a research study. A lot of people are just used to taking a post meal walk, right? That's like almost like a Thanksgiving tradition. Or in a lot of places in the world, yeah, it's just what you do after you eat. And it significantly attenuated the blood glucose spike that happens after you eat. So it's obviously, people have said it's helpful for digestion. May be the case, certainly helpful for reducing sort of the blood sugar impact. So I think, by the way, if you ever have like a sugary treat or you're indulging in excess carbs, definitely going for a walk does help in terms of making sure that your metabolism doesn't slow down. I've actually even funnily found that even when I'm traveling. So I definitely lift weights all the time, at least 3 to 5 times a week. When I was, traveling in Europe and, there's no gym, I was afraid from not lifting weights and also consuming much more carbs than I usually do. I was definitely indulging in some European beer every once in a while, at least back in the day, or Italian pasta or whatever it was. In fact, I did not gain weight. I actually lost weight, which I was really surprised. I didn't have much weight to lose in the first place. But I was walking, 13, 15,000, 20,000 steps a day, probably 2x what I was doing at home. And it really just showed that even though I was really fit working out on a regular basis, the amount of metabolic slowdown that occurs from being sedentary and not walking very much probably, in fact, has more of an influence on your weight than even the amount of carbs that you're eating. So that's the first thing. And that was a very profound realization to me. So I very much advocate for people, do your low intensity steady state exercise, making sure you're getting your sufficient walking, the 7,500 or 30 minutes a day. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is you have to do medium intensity exercise, right? So that's where the body weight stuff, the strength training, weightlifting come in. If you monitor your pulse when you're lifting weights, it doesn't actually go very high compared to doing real cardio, real intense running, right? When I was running competitively, I would wear a heart rate monitor, and regularly my heart rate would get into the 180s, 190, right? And then this is from someone whose baseline heart rate is probably 50, right? So you're almost talking a 3 to 4x increase in heart rate. When I'm lifting weights though, heart rate usually stays between 120, 150. And that's when it's more medium intensity exercise. And that makes sense because when you're lifting weights, you can either, as the old adage says, you can go long or you can go hard, but you can't keep your heart rate at 190 for 30, 60 minutes. It's just not feasible, or even if you can, maybe for a short period of time, you're going to burn out very quickly doing that. So obviously, if you have access to a gym, go do that. If you just bought those kettlebells, that's great. There's a lot of great resources on that. There's a guy, Pavel, I can't pronounce his last name, who's been on the Joe Rogan podcast. I would look up his stuff. He has a lot of great programs for kettlebell training that you can do. I think it's a very efficient, very Lindy, way of working out. I think I've shared on my Twitter, Persian or Indian clubs were essentially the original kettlebells. They've been using those for thousands of years, just swinging them around, which obviously helps upper body development, but also it's a great just overall, workout because, it's essentially the original compound lifting, right? You're using all of your muscles when you're swinging something rather than doing very, specialized kind of workout. For folks at home who don't have, let's say, access to a gym these days, or kettlebells or, free weights at home, you certainly can do a lot with body weight. There's a great friend of mine, Jerry, check out his YouTube, body weight strength training. And he has a lot of routines that go from anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes that you can do with no equipment at all, just your body weight at home. So whatever equipment you have or no equipment at all, the recommendation is to do basically medium intensity exercise about 3 times a week or every other day. You can do it, I would say, maybe 3 to 5 times a week. I'm a little bit more intense, I would say, than more folks, so I'm going for volume, and so I lift weights 5 times a week. But I think for most people, even 2 to 3 times a week or every other day, if that's 3 to 4 times a week, is sufficient. And it's absolutely necessary, not only for building muscle mass, obviously that benefits from strength training, but building bone density. And people underappreciate that actually as one of the benefits from strength training is you need resistance essentially that comes from, resistance from the weights or from doing, even running, I would argue, is a superior activity to cycling as long as your joints can hold up to it. the notion has always been traditionally that running is too impactful, right? That it's going to damage your knees over time, which obviously in excess is true. But if you're not doing a ton of running and you're not grinding it out, in some ways it actually may be superior to a no impact sport like cycling. People were actually finding really intense competitive cyclists were actually losing bone density because they'd occasionally have these accidents. They'd fall on the ground, slam their shoulder into the ground, and break their clavicle or their collarbone. And the rate of collarbone fractures and injuries was sky high in a relatively young and fit population. So these doctors were like, why are these young fit cyclists just like having these really like porous bones that are just snapping like twigs? And they realized what was happening is these guys are cycling literally for hours a day, and they're sweating all of the electrolytes out of your system. And what's one of the most common electrolytes? Calcium, right? So they're literally leaching calcium from their bones, making their bones weak. And so when they fall down, their bones, literally snap. And so, if you're going to do like really intense, I would say that's not really true for recreational cyclists. But if you're a competitive cyclist, you're literally cycling hours a day, sweating for hours a day. You either need to make sure you're replenishing your electrolytes, supplementing calcium, and or complementing it with some sort of resistance training that's making your bones stronger, thicker, and denser. So I actually think it's absolutely critical for boys, girls, men, women to do some sort of strength training, and I think that's the right intensity. Finally, last piece of it, we talked about low intensity, medium intensity, and I do think there is an importance of doing some sort of high intensity training. So a lot of people have heard of sort of HIIT training or what's called high intensity interval training. And the thing about that kind of training, though, is, as I was saying, if you're talking about getting your heart rate up to the 180s, 190s, it is kind of intense. And so you can't be doing that every day. That's absolutely going to burn you out. The rule of thumb that I would say with that is once, at most probably twice a week, you want to be doing true HIIT training. And what is HIIT training? If you're doing it the sort of the OG way, which is you could obviously do any sort of sport where it's naturally an interval, right? Soccer, for instance, basketball. So I'm a big basketball fan. I used to play basically in a league once a week. That was basically my HIIT training because you're naturally taking breaks, stopping, starting, and it's naturally structured like that. If you want to do more of a Tabata style, which is 20 minutes of sprinting, 10 seconds of breaks, you do that 8 times. It's only 4 minutes. And believe it or not, there's a ton of studies showing that 4 minutes of exercise, that obviously doesn't include like a 10-minute warm-up, but 4 minutes of intense Tabata style HIIT training actually produces just as much endurance gains as 30 up to 60 minutes of jogging or kind of that moderate intensity running that people are so fanatical about. And that kind of blew my mind as a competitive runner. When I was running competitively, I was running 30 to 50 miles a week, right, in order to go run a half a mile to 3 mile races, right? Because the whole idea was build this cardio base, do all this running. When I kind of retired, so to speak, from competitive running, but I still wanted to, be able to run quickly, be relatively fit. I actually started a HIIT club at grad school here at UCLA, and we didn't run more than 5 miles a week, literally. We trained probably I'd say 2 to 3 times a week. Doing exactly not more than 4 to 10 minutes of sprinting on a football field. We'd literally sprint half the field, walk half the field, do that, 5 to 10 times. And even though I was running 5 miles a week versus up to 50 miles a week when I was running on a team, I was able to run a sub 5-minute mile with basically a tenth of the distance. So it actually works just as well for building endurance with a lot less time, because I just didn't have time to go into grad school to be running. But I was like, I can run for 4 minutes twice a week. So it's remarkably time effective. The only trick I would say about HIIT training, especially if you're doing more of this Tabata style, is this kind of goes back to the original point of the conversation, which is your willingness and ability to do it. It's the most time effective, biggest bang for your buck type of exercise, but it hurts, right? The original guy who was Tabata, who was a Japanese scientist, he actually did it with the Olympic speed skating team in Japan. So these are like literally Olympic level athletes. And these guys, you think like a 4-minute exercise is not going to tire anyone out. These guys are like on the ground, huffing and puffing, panting after it. Because when they say sprint, they're going balls to the wall, 100% effort on those 20-second sprints, and then they're taking 10 seconds off. If you're literally doing that 8 times 20 seconds, and you're talking full exertion, full maximal effort, it will tire you out. So you have to be willing, obviously, to do that if you're going to do a highly efficient exercise. If you're not, or you haven't sort of warmed up to doing that, I obviously don't go starting to do that. If you haven't been doing any sprinting or exercise, you're obviously going to injure yourself. But you can do it with less intensity, maximal intensity. I generally recommend actually people don't go 100%. One of the things that we've learned from sprint training is to go about 80%, no more than 90% of your maximum speed. What coaches have found, if you listen to like Michael Johnson's coach, who is the famous 200, 400 meter world record holder, is when you go sprint 100%, the likelihood of hamstring tears and hamstring injuries is actually very high, because you're literally stretching your muscles, tendons, and ligaments to their maximal point. If you get to 80 to 90%, you're getting most of the benefit without risking injury. So even the Olympians in practice, they never sprint full speed. They're never going 100% because they don't want to accidentally tear or injure their hamstrings. They basically only save it for those Olympic level competitions. Interestingly, even when you watch them compete in the Olympics, if you're talking about the original sort of rounds, the semifinals, they're not even going 100% there. You can see the sprinters ease up on the last 10 to 20 meters because, again, they don't want to risk injuring their hamstring. That's why the world records in a lot of those events, they're only in the finals of the World Championships or the Olympics, because it's one of the rare times people are willing to risk injury, go balls to the wall, and run as fast as you can, like Usain Bolt running insane times. So I would say keep it at 80 to 90%. Most of us are not Olympic athletes. We don't need to risk injury. You want to live a long injury-free, surgery-free life. So find something that works for you. You can do it, obviously. You don't need any equipment. You can just go run outside. I recommend most people, if you have grass or dirt, it's a nicer surface to run or sprint on. Just do a couple intervals at a pace that's reasonable for you. If you're not much of a runner, do it at 50%. If you've kind of done a little bit more training, 80 to 90% of your maximal perceived effort. It's obviously just subjective on how you feel. Should be enough. And you only need to do it, like I said, 4 or 5 minutes at minimum, 10 minutes at maximum. And you get that high intensity training in, and that's really helpful for cardio. And I do think a lot of people, especially these days, they bash cardio. I do think cardio has been a little bit overemphasized. I think for most people, the majority of the exercise should really be focused on that middle portion, that middle intensity exercise that I was talking about. But it doesn't replace cardio. And like I said, it doesn't replace walking at a low intensity either. There's been, I'll give you a personal example of that as well. There's been periods of time in my life where I was only doing the medium intensity. I was only doing the strength training. And then I'd go out to a basketball game and I would just be winded because even though I was doing a lot of like very intense weightlifting, it just doesn't translate to basketball. It's just not enough cardio to keep in strength. And I found that just doing literally 1 day a week of that high intensity interval training or 1 day a week of basketball maintained enough of that cardiovascular capacity and endurance to keep me in maximal shape. So that is what I would say is like the ideal, if you're really trying to optimize your physical fitness, combination of things: a low intensity physical activity that's usually centered around walking, usually 30 minutes, usually every day. Medium intensity, do that basically every other day, and that should be centered around some sort of strength training, resistance training, weightlifting. And then finally, 1 to 2 days a week of a high intensity, some sort of interval sport or interval sprinting that gives you the maximal cardiovascular benefit. So I would say that combination, and at minimum, that's like 3 days a week of actual exercise and some walking every day, and you can be in phenomenal shape. You don't have to live at the gym. It can be a very low time commitment if you're willing to obviously make the commitment in terms of the effort that you put in.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. I know it's a super long-winded answer, but this is the problem when you ask someone who's spent a lot of time doing sports and studying exercise physiology. But anyway, that's my 2 cents on that. I wanted to leave some time for other questions. I know there's a bunch of folks on the Discord as well. I know some of you folks are on mute, but if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, feel free.
And one question, which actually ties into the question that I asked about supplementation.
Yeah, feel free.
What tests do you look for And now David Sinclair was on Joe Rogan. He talked about Insight Tracker.
Mm-hmm.
Look at about 43 markers, 43 tests they do. What do you test for when you go look at supplementation?
Yeah,
Magnesium, yeah.
great question. I think this is where I think it's a little bit more individualized. It's how much effort and how much time and money are you willing to spend, right? I think for most people, the general recommendation that I would make is make sure you go and get an annual physical exam. Most people essentially have no relationship with their doctor whatsoever. Unfortunately, health insurance in America sucks. I think it's a disaster that people don't have health insurance, or if they do, they have these high insurance plans where it's not really useful, and they're afraid of going to the doctor because obviously it's going to incur a large expense. But I think what most people don't realize is most people, at least if they have decent insurance, you do get an obligatory annual physical exam. It's usually free, and they usually even waive the copay. Depends on your plan, but most plans, like, it's pretty kosher to see your doctor once a year without getting charged a lot of money. I highly recommend it. There's really, especially for guys, there's really basic things. Even though it's a little uncomfortable, you should probably have your prostate checked. You should be checked for testicular cancer. These are things that are better done in person, obviously. So I highly recommend that you just start out by having a relationship with some sort of primary care provider, and making sure you get your annual physical done. So that's rule number one. It's like general maintenance, right? Like, just like you change the oil in your car, you should check your check engine light of your body by making sure, and you go having an annual physical exam is generally a good idea. Now, as part of that exam, I do actually suggest that you ask your doctor to get what's called routine blood work. Now, what exactly is routine varies in terms of people's definition, but a CBC, comprehensive blood count, CMP, comprehensive metabolic panel, are two little acronyms, and they kind of like measure most standard markers. I don't know if I didn't listen to the David Sinclair podcast, but it measures probably the same around a couple dozen markers, and just makes sure there's no glaring abnormalities in terms of your blood work that you should be aware of. Most people who are relatively healthy, you're not going to see anything that's really abnormal, but it can indicate if there is some things. So I would say one thing that you should always check, especially in that, which is very, very relevant for most men, is your fasting plasma glucose levels, your fasting blood sugar levels, or A1C. The difference between the two measures is the FPG or FBG is basically your blood sugar levels that morning. That's why the doctors ask you to fast, because obviously if you have a Krispy Kreme donut that morning, it's going to spike your blood sugar. It doesn't really tell you much other than it's terrible for you, and don't eat Krispy Kreme and Soylent. But yeah, if you've been fasting, it's really telling you what's literally the amount of dissolved glucose in your blood at the time of the test. The A1C test, on the other hand, it's basically an average measure of your blood sugar over the last 90 days. So you don't even have to be fasted for that. You can walk into any Costco or Walgreens, and they often have these A1C tests, and it gives you more of a measure over the last 3 months. So it's a more stable measure. They're both useful. They're both slightly different, but no matter which one you take, you should have an indication of your blood sugar levels. I think it's really critical because I spent a lot of time working in the diabetes space, and basically 10% of men are diabetic. So you have a fasting plasma glucose level above 125. So if you're 126 or above, you're considered type 2 diabetic, basically. Unfortunately, most guys have never even measured their blood sugar levels at all. They have no idea. Same thing, if your levels are between 100 and 125, you have what's called prediabetes, where you don't have diabetes yet, but your levels are high enough that you're essentially at risk, and 50% of those people over the next decade are going to convert to type 2 diabetes. 89% of men with prediabetes have no clue they have prediabetes. They have no idea they're at risk. They're eventually just going to get sicker and sicker, and then one day they start noticing that they're urinating excessively, they're really thirsty, they're getting energy spikes and energy crashes, and then they go to the doctor and they're like, hey, I have some bad news, you have diabetes. And they're like, what do you mean? I never knew I had diabetes. Well, it's like, well, you've been pre-diabetic for 10, 20 years and you've never gone to the doctor, as a lot of guys do, because they're like, oh, I'm fine, I'm not dying. with that machismo mentality. And they never know. So make sure I recommend, it doesn't matter even if you're young, healthy in your 20s. I'll tell you actually my personal experience with this. I'm super fit. Like I said, no health issues, no metabolic problems, but I do have a family history of diabetes. And so my doctor would never routinely measure my blood sugar levels. I had no idea what it was. I had to go ask him and convince him basically to say, hey, like my dad has type 2 diabetes. I know I'm at risk just with family history. Can I get mine measured? And he's like, sure. But it required me taking the proactive step of asking. So I highly recommend that everyone do that, because if you actually do the math, 37% of Americans have prediabetes, 10 to 12% have diabetes, especially 12% if you include the folks that are undiagnosed. So basically 49, almost 50% of Americans have elevated blood sugar levels. So you have basically a 1 in 2 chance of having abnormal blood sugar levels, which is really sad state of affairs. So this isn't a rare thing. We're talking about, if you actually have normal blood sugar levels, I would say in 2020, you're in the minority of folks. And most guys have no clue. So make sure you get that checked. Now, hormone testing in particular is definitely not routine. Unless you're symptomatic, meaning you're exhibiting like low libido, low energy, these kinds of symptoms, your doctor's not going to test your hormone levels, your testosterone levels. I personally think that's a little bit of a shame. I understand the rationale for it, though. We live in a managed care system. Health insurance doesn't want to pay for things. They don't want to pay for, extra tests if they don't have to. But usually if you have a good relationship with your doctor, which is why you should go get an annual physical, because then, you have some rapport, you have a bond. You can ask for things and people are nicer when you're not like a random stranger who pops up. I've never seen you before and you're demanding a testosterone test, versus you're like, hey doc, you know me, we've been working together for years. I'm not feeling the same in my 30s as I did in my 20s. Just want to check and see if there's anything going on. And then, it's up to the physician's discretion, but usually when you ask like that, they're more likely to, be amenable to it and order the test for you. So yeah, build a relationship and ask nicely. Usually you can get a standard panel done. So standard hormone test usually includes total testosterone. You can order what's called a free or bioavailable testosterone as well. That's more relevant because it's the more active testosterone that can actually bind to the androgen receptors. But quite honestly, in most guys, just a total testosterone, if you're not symptomatic, is usually indication enough of what's going on. So if you can get the free done, I would say it's a nice cherry on top. It gives you a little bit more information. The other way of going about it is there's 2 other markers, albumin and SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin. If you have those 3 things, you can essentially calculate what the free testosterone is. So either way, you can either get it measured directly or you can calculate it by just getting those three markers measured. But that'll give you essentially an indication of your free or calculated free testosterone. The other important hormone to measure is your estrogen. There's different types of estrogens. The most common of one is called estradiol, or E2. You can think about, this is an oversimplification, but it's a useful heuristic. Testosterone is the very male masculinizing hormone. Estradiol or estrogen is sort of the female feminizing hormone. Both men and women have both. They're actually both critical. As a man, you actually do want estradiol. In fact, we know this because when you shut down your estradiol levels from actually like abusing anabolic steroids or taking things like aromatase inhibitors, which lower estradiol levels, it actually causes a lot of problems in men. You get very dry, creaky joints if you don't have sufficient estrogen, and it's cardioprotective, and it affects your brain function as well. So it is actually important for men to have estradiol levels, and you want to check it and make sure those are good as well. The ratios between them are different for men and women. Obviously, men have much higher testosterone levels, much lower estradiol levels. Women have much higher estradiol and estrogens, much lower testosterone levels. But you want to check both because what's important is also the balance or ratio between them. So there's something called the T to E ratio, or the testosterone to estradiol ratio. It's the ratio between testosterone and estradiol. As a guy, you want to make sure that's generally over 10, meaning you have at least 10 times as much testosterone as you do, estradiol. So let's say your estradiol levels are about 20, which would be kind of normal. You'd want your testosterone to at least be 200, right? And 200 is actually pretty low. That's technically hypogonadal. But at the very minimum, you'd want it to be somewhere around there if you're measuring it in the standard units that they're sort of measured. For most guys, the problem with the lab test is that it's a very wide range. They don't really consider you to have low testosterone unless you're like generally below 300, and the normal range extends up to depends on the lab. It could be 800, 900, 1,000. I usually say kind of 300 to 900 is the normal range, but that's obviously a 3x differential from the lowest to the highest. What I think is more useful is to say for your age and your level of health, what are your testosterone levels? The more normal sort of median, I would say for most guys, kind of being between, if you're talking about a healthy, relatively young, below 65 male that doesn't have any sort of chronic medical conditions, 400 to 600 would be more of like a median range in terms of the total testosterone numbers. Now, there is a little bit of individual variability, and it's not going to make a huge difference if you're like 400 versus 600 in terms of your ability to put on, let's say, muscle mass per se. But obviously, some folks who are, whether genetically gifted or they have really optimal lifestyle levels, their testosterone levels are higher, 700, 800, 900. Certainly, I would say a lot of athletes sort of naturally fall into that category. And it is better in terms of, it's predictive. There's a great BBC documentary where, they basically could predict the outcome of a race in track based on just testosterone levels. Does, quite frankly, give you a competitive advantage. That's why obviously a lot of athletes abuse either testosterone or anabolic, agents that increase or function like testosterone because it works. Testosterone increases muscle mass, decreases fat mass, increases drive, increases confidence. And so it does have a lot of benefits. So I do recommend that as part of a routine screening, just to kind of know where your levels are at. And if they are low, then you can work with your doctor to figure out why. That's the other key question that people are sort of missing is if you're low, there's lots of reasons. The number one reason I would say that for most people why their testosterone level is low is because of obesity and metabolic syndrome, right? 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. 88% have some sort of metabolic dysregularity. And it does influence things because when you have excess body fat, it actually aromatizes, which is a fancy word for basically your testosterone levels. And by the way, this is one of the beauties of nature. We talked about testosterone and estradiol as being the male and female hormones. Your body literally converts testosterone into estradiol. It literally takes the male hormone, turns it into the female hormone through an enzyme called aromatase. And the thing is, where does that aromatase enzyme live? It literally lives in your body fat. So if you're a fat man, if you're an obese guy, you have all this extra aromatase enzyme floating around. So that ratio between testosterone and estradiol becomes more out of balance because it's converting more of your testosterone into estradiol. So instead of necessarily like throwing you on an aromatase inhibitor to rebalance that, the first thing you should do in terms of lifestyle preventative medicine is to reduce your body fat down to a more normal level, right? So guys should definitely try to, I would say, optimally be at like 15% body fat. We can get down a little bit lower. Obviously, you might like have better looking abs at 10 to 12%. But I think for most guys, striving for 15% as an optimal amount is critical. I would say even most guys getting down to 20 would be a huge win because most guys are way, way higher than that. Believe it or not, the average waist size of an American male is now 40 inches. Mind-blowing, right? For most guys, when the average American male is about 5'9", 5'9 and a half. So if you're thinking about someone who's that height with a 40-inch waist, it's like literally a pear-shaped individual. Most guys should have about a 30-inch waist, maybe up to 34 if they're particularly kind of wide set with hip bones. But there's not a lot of reason you should have more than a 36-inch waist, assuming you have 10 to 15% body fat. So the number one thing I always recommend to people is just make sure get your body fat down in terms of making sure your hormone function is optimal.
What body fat test do you like?
Yeah,
Caliper or electric or the water tub or...
A DEXA scan is the most accurate. I think for most people, quite frankly, it's overkill. Like, do you really need to spend $60 to $100 on getting a super accurate body fat measure? I would say probably not. There are some interesting stuff now. The Amazon has a new Halo wristband. I'm not wearing mine right now, but it actually does a 3D scan of your body. It's super cool. It's like visual AI, and it actually estimate your body fat levels more accurately than the scales. The scales are essentially worthless in terms of body fat. They do an electrical impedance measure where it's running a little current through your limbs essentially. But the problem is if you're an athletic male like me, it thinks I have like 22% body fat when my body fat's at like 12%. And so I would say the best thing you should do is honestly the visual rule of thumb of looking in a mirror is probably the best guide. I can send a little picture in the Discord afterwards, but you can just like look at what 10, 12, 15, 20% looks like, and just look at yourself in the mirror, and you can almost pretty much match up. And I would say within probably 5% error, you pretty much know what body fat you are. Like for instance, you don't really have a visible, distinctly clear six pack unless you're at basically below 12% body fat. If you don't have a visible six pack and you can clearly see them all, you're definitely above it. If you have like zero abs, you're probably at like 20%, I would say. 15, you might have like a 2-pack or a 4-pack. So you can kind of use these visual rules of thumb. And I think it's a good enough rule of thumb, quite honestly, for most people. The other thing you can do is just, if you have obviously a tape measure, just measure your waist circumference. It's actually a very useful rule of thumb. It's actually technically better than BMI in terms of prognostic of health outcomes. So yeah, if you start out with a 36-inch waist, you get on some nutrition exercise plan, you're down to 35, 34 inches, your pants fit better. That's a very useful rule of thumb that you've, shifted in the right direction. Second thing that's really critical for hormone functioning, I would say before we talk about supplementation and drugs, is get your sleep right. It is absolutely critical for hormone functioning. So the first thing I would say too is, if you're overweight, or I would say especially if you're obese and you've heard from your partner that you snore, or particularly if you stop sort of breathing, you're kind of like and gasping in the middle of the night, as I kind of demonstrated right there, you may have sleep apnea. So I actually highly suggest folks who either you're obese and your partner's telling you snore, or there are folks just because of their anatomical structure, you can be very fit and young and still have some sort of obstructed breathing because of just your physiology. Get a sleep test done. That, again, it's not going to be a routine thing that your doctor screens for, but if you notice, for instance, that you have like very low energy levels, and you shouldn't, because otherwise you eat right, you exercise, you do all the you're getting enough sleep theoretically, but you're still tired, it's very, very useful to get a sleep study done. Typically what that involves is you go overnight to a sleep lab. They hook up EEG, so they're monitoring your brain waves. They're measuring your oxygen levels, and they're studying you overnight and making sure that you don't have sort of sleep apnea. That's the number one thing that I think also contributes to unnecessary metabolic syndrome, and also lower hormones and testosterone. Is if you're not getting quality deep sleep because of sleep apnea. When people treat that and they get a CPAP machine or other things that can be helpful, it'll turn their health and their hormones around. There is kind of like subclinical kind of sleep conditions where you may not have full-blown sleep apnea, but you may have some slight obstruction, some difficulty breathing, and there's less onerous solutions than a full CPAP device. So there are these oral appliances now, dentists and orthodontists make them. All it does is it basically shifts your jaw a little bit forward while you're sleeping. It actually does two nice things. First of all, if you're stressed, if you're someone who's stressed out and you grind your teeth, it prevents you from grinding your teeth. If you have nice teeth that you've kept straight from wearing braces, it keeps your teeth straight. But most importantly, by moving your jaw forward, it basically prevents your tongue from falling into the back of your throat and obstructing your breathing. So it actually can basically cure snoring and reduce any sort of like subclinical apneas or interruptions in your sleep, which can really help improve the quality of your sleep. So I think there's a lot of folks who basically have undiagnosed sleep apnea. They should definitely be on a CPAP. Those are the more obese folks. For the folks that are not so obese, if you do have problems snoring, or your partner complains about or notices that you're interrupting your breathing, or you notice you're just chronically fatigued all the time, in that case, I would still recommend a sleep study and maybe like an oral appliance or another sort of solution can be very helpful. So make sure you fix your body fat and your sleep before doing anything else, because those are going to actually have the biggest bang for your buck impacts. Because there's a lot of guys out there, they may actually have naturally high testosterone levels, but they test low because of their extra body fat or because their sleep is so messed up that, it could naturally be 800, but they're testing at 400 because they haven't fixed those things. So that's, I think, the critical thing to take care of. Third thing I would say is if you're talking about sleep disorders, is just making sure you're getting enough sleep. We're unfortunately in a chronically sleep deprived society where we just don't get enough sleep. And I think, unfortunately, there's a myth that we don't need very much sleep. There's a lot of folks out there, and I think it's honestly because of caffeine abuse and dependence. They're like, I'm fine getting 5-6 hours of sleep a night. I know a lot of professional colleagues of mine who say that, both in healthcare and tech. And then the first thing I ask them whenever they're like, oh, I'm fine on 5 hours of sleep, I'm like, how much caffeine are you drinking? They're like, yeah, 2-3 cups of coffee a day. I'm like, yeah, you're enabling yourself to get 5-6. You're functional on 5-6 hours of sleep, but I'm pretty sure if you consume 0 stimulants, you'd be dragging your ass through the day and not very functional. So you're essentially relying on an external drug to mask the effects of sleep deprivation, which, yeah, it works in the short term, but long term, you're literally like hurting and harming your health. So what I would say is, general rule of thumb, everyone should be getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep a night. That's my best read of the science. There's probably a little bit of individual variability, but really, I don't think there's any reason anyone should get less than 6 hours of sleep a night, quite frankly. And so the question is, well, why? How do I know I need 7 or 8 or 9? One, you got to listen to your body a little bit, but two, it does matter in terms of your level of physical activity. If you're relatively sedentary, maybe 7 to 8 is enough. Obviously, if you're really working out, you're very active, or you're very mentally active. I obviously work with a lot of CEOs, and they're working hard 12 hours a day. And I'd say, hey, look, you're a corporate athlete. You need to rest your mind. Because you're literally burning, the brain burns glucose and ketones. You need more rest than other people. So I very much focus on working with folks who are athletic or corporate athletes. They should be getting closer to the 8 to 9 hours of sleep range. So make sure you're doing that and optimizing that. If you need help with that, that's obviously why we started this Maximus tribe on Discord. We have a sleep accountability group that I'm obviously going to give a shout out to right now. So you can go on the Discord. There's a little channel called Find a Partner. And all you have to do is say, hey, look, I want to optimize my sleep. Can I find someone else who basically is going to be my accountability buddy? We'll pair you one-on-one with someone. And the premise is super simple. All you do is you check in every single day with that person about what your sleep goal is. So I do this. So my accountability partner is my buddy Mike. We chat on Discord every day. I have a goal to go to sleep by midnight every night. I'm not perfect about it all the time, but I've gotten better about it because the next day I check in and I tell Mike, did I do it or not? And so there's sort of the digital walk of shame if I don't do it. And if I don't, then I'm like, what got in the way? Was I up, on Twitter? Was there something that was on my mind, etc. And it really helps you keep accountable. So I highly recommend if you do want to optimize your sleep, that you do that. And join us. It's a free group. We don't charge anything for it. It's because it's all peer based, right? It's all peer accountability. It's men helping other men, improve their sleep. So I would say fix all those things first. And then, next week I'll talk more about the supplementation and the prescription side of things. So let's focus a little bit more on the lifestyle for today's conversation. We can dedicate a whole other radio show or podcast to that as well.